The heat was a physical presence. It rose in shimmering waves from the packed earth of the Yuma-proving ground, a vast, sun-blasted canvas of ochre and beige that stretched to a horizon blurred by thermal distortion. It was a place designed to break things, equipment, spirits, the very laws of physics as men understood them. The air itself was an adversary, thick with the grit of the Sonoran Desert and the acrid tang of burnt cordite. It tasted of brass and failure. Sounds were either swallowed by the immense emptiness or carried with unnatural clarity. The sharp crack of a high-velocity round leaving a barrel, the distant delayed thwack of its arrival, and the ceaseless grating monologue of Gunnery Sergeant Rex Thorne. Thorne was a roaring bonfire of a man, built of cast iron and indignation. He stood on the primary firing line, a slab of granite in Marine Corps digital desert camouflage, his voice a gravelly bark that needed no amplification to carry over the whisper of the wind. He was holding court, his audience a semicircle of younger operators, Marine Scout snipers in training and a few quiet, watchful Navy SEAL candidates. They were the chorus, their faces a mixture of awe and eagerness, hanging on his every proclamation. Thorne gestured with a meaty hand toward the distant shimmering targets, little more than heat-warped specks against a far-off berm. "Look at that," he boomed, his voice a tool of blunt force trauma. 2,475 yards. That last plate, the Deceptor, they call it. You've got a variable crosswind coming down off the Chocolate Mountains. You've got ground-level mirage that'll make that target dance like a stripper on payday. And you've got the Coriolis effect trying to pull your round into the next county. It's not a shot, gentlemen. It's a prayer. He paused for effect, letting the weight of the impossibility settle over them. He was a performer, and this range was his stage. His competence was real, but it was brittle, lacquered over with layers of performative arrogance. Unseen and unheard, some 50 yards away, a figure moved with a quiet economy that was the antithesis of Thorne's bombast. She was dressed in sterile, sand-colored contractor fatigues, devoid of rank or unit patches. Her ball cap was pulled low, casting her face in shadow. To the assembled operators, if they noticed her at all, she was just part of the range infrastructure, an anonymous technician responsible for the complex network of sensors and reactive targets that dotted the landscape. Her name was Anya Petrova, and she was calibrating a LiDAR wind sensor, her touch on the delicate instrument as light and precise as a surgeon's. Petrova's world was one of data and whispers. While Thorne spoke of prayers and dancing strippers, she was listening to the language of the desert. She felt the subtle shift in wind pressure on her cheek, a downslope katabatic breeze that the range's primary anemometers, positioned 100 feet higher, would miss entirely. She saw the way the mirage wasn't just shimmering, but boiling, running left to right in a lazy river of distorted light, a clear indicator of a velocity shift in the first 500 yards of the bullet's path. Her stillness was armor, her silence a library of accumulated knowledge. She was perceived as insignificant, a ghost in the machine, and that was exactly how she preferred it. Her focus was on her task, ensuring the data the shooters received was as pure as the unforgiving physics it represented. She finished with the sensor, her fingers moving over the keypad of a small, ruggedized tablet. A stream of numbers flowed across the screen: barometric pressure, humidity, dew point, wind vectors at 20-yard increments. To her, this was not a prayer. It was a mathematical equation of immense complexity, and she was here to solve for X. She noticed a slight discrepancy in the data feed from Thorne's firing position, a minute drift in the baseline calibration of his Kestrel weather meter. It was a small thing, an error of less than half a mile per hour in wind speed. But at this range, half a mile per hour was the difference between a center mass hit and a puff of dust a yard wide of the target. Quietly, she began walking toward the firing line, her boots making almost no sound on the hard-packed dirt. Her intention was simple: to make a discrete correction to the data hub that fed the shooter's ballistic computers, ensuring the information was pure. She had no desire to interact, to be seen, or to be acknowledged. She was a maintainer, a custodian of facts in a place where ego often distorted them. Thorne was mid-sentence, a grand pronouncement about spindrift and the Magnus effect, when a flicker of movement at the edge of his vision snagged his attention. It was the target girl, the quiet contractor walking toward his station, her eyes on the data hub connected to his rifle setup. A surge of proprietary anger flared in his chest. This was his domain, his lecture, his audience. Her presence was an intrusion, a dissonant note in his carefully orchestrated symphony of authority. "Hey, you!" His voice cracked like a whip, sharp and sudden. The chorus flinched. Petrova stopped, her expression unreadable beneath the shadow of her cap. She looked at him, her gaze calm, waiting. "What do you think you're doing, sweetheart?" The word sweetheart was laced with corrosive condescension, designed to diminish and dismiss. Petrova didn't react to the epithet. Her voice, when it came, was low and uninflected, a simple statement of fact. "There's a microshear just past the first transonic barrier. Your ground station isn't reading it. I'm correcting the data feed." She spoke of atmospheric physics as if discussing the weather, her tone flat and devoid of challenge. Her response, in its serene factuality, was more infuriating to Thorne than any argument would have been. It denied him the emotional reaction he craved. It bypassed his authority and went straight to the cold, hard data, implying his own setup was flawed. It was an unintentional and therefore unforgivable challenge to his mastery. His face flushed a dark, mottled red. "You're correcting my data?" he sneered, taking a step toward her, puffing out his chest. He was a foot taller and 100 pounds heavier, a physical wall of intimidation. "You're the girl who sets up the targets. You plug things in. You don't touch a marine gunner's gear. You don't correct anything. Is that clear, librarian?" The new nickname, librarian, got a few sycophantic chuckles from the chorus. They looked from their godlike instructor to the small, unassuming woman, and the power dynamic seemed laughably clear. Petrova's gaze remained steady. There was no fear in her eyes, no anger, only a deep, abiding calm that seemed to unnerve Thorne more than anything else. She gave a short, single nod. It was not a gesture of submission, but one of simple acknowledgement. She had stated a fact. He had rejected it. The conversation, from her perspective, was over. The consequence of his flawed data was now his alone. She turned to walk away, her duty discharged. Her silent dismissal was the final insult. "That's right, walk away," he called after her, his voice dripping with triumphant scorn. "Go back to your wires and your batteries. The men will handle the shooting." He turned back to his audience, his dominance reasserted. "Now, as I was saying, the key to a shot like this is trusting your gear, but more importantly, trusting your gut. It's an art, not a science." He conveniently ignored the fact that the art was entirely dependent on the science he had just so arrogantly dismissed. The incident was over, but a seed had been planted. In the back of the group, a Navy SEAL chief petty officer, a man they called Monk, watched Petrova's retreating form, his eyes narrowed in thought. He had seen the way she moved, the way she observed. It wasn't the look of a technician, it was the look of a predator. The day wore on, a long, grueling marathon of steel and sun. The exercise was designed to push the operators to their absolute limits. They engaged targets from 1,000 yards out to 2,000, each shot a complex problem of ballistics and atmospheric science. Thorne coached them, his voice a constant, overbearing presence, correcting their postures, critiquing their breathing, celebrating their hits with loud proclamations of his own teaching prowess. He was a good shot. There was no denying it. He could make the calculations, read the wind with a practiced eye, and send rounds downrange with consistent accuracy. He hit the 1,000-yard plate, the 1,250, the 1,500, the 1,800. After each successful impact, he would stand up, a smug grin on his face, and explain to the chorus precisely why the shot had been so difficult and how his unique insights had made it possible. Finally, the moment of truth arrived. The sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, and making the conditions even more treacherous. The light was failing, the mirage was at its worst, and the winds, no longer driven by the full heat of the day, were becoming fickle and unpredictable. It was time for the final target, the Deceptor, at 2,475 yards. It was a challenge plate, a mythical beast of a shot that served more as a humbling reminder of limitations than as a practical training objective. The official range record was a single lucky hit made years ago on a day with impossibly perfect conditions. "All right, gentlemen, watch a master at work," Thorne announced, settling his massive frame behind his M110 SAS. The rifle was a beautiful, brutal piece of machinery, but it was straining at the very edge of its effective range. He went through his process with theatrical precision, adjusting his scope, checking his data on a wrist-mounted computer, the very data he had refused to allow Petrova to correct. He spent a full 10 minutes preparing, making a great show of testing the wind with his Kestrel, licking a finger and holding it up in a parody of old-world marksmanship. The chorus watched in reverent silence. He settled in, his breathing slowing. He muttered his calculations aloud for the benefit of his audience. Wind is 7 miles per hour, full value from the right, holding 2.2 mils left, elevation 41 mils up, praying the Coriolis doesn't bite me in the ass. He took a final breath, let half of it out, and his finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle bucked against his shoulder with a deafening roar. The concussion kicked up a cloud of dust around him. Every eye on the line strained to see the result. The flight time for the bullet was over 4 seconds, 4 agonizingly long seconds of silence, filled only by the whisper of the desert wind. Then, a small, pathetic puff of dust erupted from the berm, a good 5 feet to the right and a foot low of the target. A clean miss. Thorne swore under his breath, a low, guttural curse. He quickly cycled the bolt and prepared for a follow-up shot. "Damn wind shifted," he announced, his voice tight with frustration. "See that? The Mirage lied. You can't trust the data." He fired again. Another 4-second wait, another puff of dust, this time slightly closer, but still a clear miss. He tried 3 more times, his movements becoming more jerky, his frustration radiating off him in palpable waves. Each shot was a failure. Finally, he pushed himself up, slamming a magazine onto his shooting mat in a fit of pique. "It's the conditions," he declared, his voice loud and defensive. "Impossible. The wind shear is unpredictable today, and that target calibration feels off, probably what that girl was screwing with earlier." He deflected the blame with the ease of long practice, casting a dark look in the direction of the small workshop where Petrova had disappeared. His ego, bruised but not broken, had found its scapegoat. The chorus nodded sympathetically. The shot was impossible, after all. The gunnery sergeant had said so himself. No one could be expected to make it. Observing from a shaded command tent set back from the line was Colonel Marcus Vance. Vance was a man carved from a different stone than Thorne. Where the gunny was loud, Vance was quiet. Where Thorne was a performer, Vance was an observer. He was a Marsoc legend, a man whose quiet competence had become the stuff of whispered stories in forward operating bases from Helmand to the Horn of Africa. He had seen Thorne's performance, heard his excuses, and his face was a mask of cold disappointment. Competence was the only currency Vance valued, and Thorne was proving to be bankrupt. Vance stepped out of the tent, his presence immediately silencing the low murmurs on the firing line. He walked slowly toward the dejected group. His eyes swept over the young operators, then over Thorne. And finally, he looked out at the distant untouched deceptor plate. "Is that it, Gunner?" Vance asked, his voice soft but carrying an undeniable weight of command. "Are we done here?" Thorne, flustered by the colonel's sudden appearance, snapped to a position of parade rest. "Sir, conditions are untenable. The shot is not viable today. The equipment is reading inconsistently." He gestured vaguely toward the workshop again, the implication clear. Vance let the silence hang for a moment before he spoke again. "Does anyone else want to attempt the shot?" His question was addressed to the entire group. He was met with a sea of downcast eyes and shuffling feet. No one wanted to risk the same public failure their instructor had just endured. The myth of the shot's impossibility had been firmly cemented by Thorne's blustering failure. From the side of the range, Petrova emerged from the workshop. Her work for the day was done. The targets were set to be remotely retracted for the night, and the sensors were logging their final data streams. She carried a small toolkit in one hand and her tablet in the other, her path taking her past the firing line on her way to the vehicle park. She moved with her head down, intent on remaining invisible, on simply leaving this theater of ego and noise behind. As she passed, Thorne, needing one last target for his frustration, couldn't resist a final sarcastic barb. "Well, well," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "If it isn't the data expert, maybe the librarian wants a shot? Think you can fix the wind with that little magic box of yours?" Petrova stopped. She did not look at Thorne. She simply stood there, a still point in a world of tension. She had been about to let it all go, to fade back into the anonymity she cherished. But the condescending challenge, the public dismissal, not just of her, but of the very principles of scientific precision she embodied, struck a nerve deep inside her. It was an offense against the craft itself. Before she could respond or simply walk away, another figure moved. Chief Petty Officer Kai Tanaka, the man they called Monk, detached himself from the group of SEALs. He had been watching everything, his face impassive. He had seen Thorne's sloppy wind read. He had seen his reliance on gut instinct over hard data, and he had seen the quiet, coiled stillness of the woman Thorne was mocking. Monk was a student of human movement, of the subtle tells that separated the pretenders from the masters. He saw mastery in her. Without a word, Monk unslung the rifle from his own back. It was not a standard-issue weapon. It was a Mark 22 advanced sniper rifle, a marvel of modular engineering, customized to his exact specifications. The scope was a Schmidt and Bender with a Horus Tremor 3 reticle, an instrument of terrifying precision. The entire system was a masterpiece, worth more than a luxury car. He walked directly to Petrova, holding the rifle out to her, stock first. The entire range fell silent. This was an unprecedented gesture. A SEAL sniper, a member of the most elite and secretive brotherhood in the military, was offering his personal weapon, an almost sacred object, to a civilian contractor. It was an act of profound, silent trust. It was a public refutation of Thorne's judgment. Monk stopped in front of her. His eyes met hers. They were dark and intelligent, and they held no mockery, only a quiet, professional curiosity. "Ma'am," he said, his voice a low rumble, "the data feels right. Maybe the rifle was the problem." He offered the weapon again. "Use mine." He then did something even more remarkable. He stepped away. He did not offer advice. He did not hover. He simply gave her the tool and retreated, leaving the stage entirely to her. It was the ultimate vote of confidence, a master acknowledging a potential peer. Anya Petrova looked at the rifle in her hands. It felt perfectly balanced, an extension of intent. She looked at Monk, who gave her a slight, almost imperceptible nod. She looked at the stunned face of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, whose jaw was hanging open in disbelief. And then she looked out at the distant, impossible target. She had not sought this. She had not wanted this. But the challenge had been issued, and the tools had been provided. An artist, when given a perfect instrument, is compelled to create. She walked to the firing position Thorne had just vacated and laid down on the mat. The motion was a single, fluid gesture, a seamless union of body and earth. There was no wasted energy, no hesitation. The chorus of young operators watched, their skepticism warring with a dawning sense of anticipation. They had just witnessed one legend, Thorne, fail spectacularly. Now they were about to witness something else entirely, though they did not yet know what it was. Petrova settled behind the Mk-22. She did not immediately put her eye to the scope. Instead, she closed her eyes for a moment, her body becoming perfectly still. She was not praying. She was listening. She felt the rifle's cold stock against her cheek, the slight texture of the pistol grip in her hand, the weight of the bipod settling into the mat. She was becoming one with the system. Her breathing slowed until it was almost imperceptible, syncing with the rhythm of the wind itself. Then her eyes opened. They were a pale, piercing blue, and they seemed to absorb the landscape, to drink in the data that instruments could only approximate. She scanned the terrain between her and the target, not as a single plane, but as a series of atmospheric layers. She saw the river of mirage, the dust devils dancing 1,000 yards out, the way the tall grasses on a distant ridge bent in a direction completely opposite to the wind she felt on her skin. She was reading the story of the air. She glanced at the tablet connected to Monk's rifle. It displayed a firing solution calculated by a sophisticated ballistic engine, factoring in all the data she herself had just verified. It recommended an adjustment of 42.7 mils of elevation and 2.9 mils of windage. It was a good solution. A 95% solution. But the last 5% was not science. It was art. It was the whisper she had heard that the machines had missed. With deft, minimal movements, she reached for the elevation turret on the massive scope. She dialed not to 42.7, but to 42.9, a tiny, almost insignificant addition. Then she adjusted the windage knob. The computer had said 2.9 mils. She dialed it to 3.1, and then with a touch so fine it was barely visible, she added one more click. A single, confident adjustment that seemed to fly in the face of the available data. Thorne, watching from the side, let out a snort of derisive laughter. "Amateur," he muttered to the man next to him. "She's overdoping it. She'll miss by a mile." Petrova ignored him. She was in the bubble, a state of hyper-focused consciousness where the outside world ceased to exist. There was only her, the rifle, the air, and the target. She chambered around, the click of the bolt seating the .338 Norma Magnum cartridge sounding unnaturally loud in the dead silence. She put her eye to the scope. The world through the Schmidt and Bender glass was a thing of impossible clarity. The deceptor plate, a fuzzy, heat-warped smudge to the naked eye, was now a sharp-edged rectangle of AR-500 steel. The mirage was still present, making the target swim in her vision, but she didn't fight it. She watched its rhythm, timing her own breathing to its cadence. Her crosshairs were not held steady on the center of the plate. They were holding high and to the left, in a patch of empty air that made no logical sense to anyone watching. She took a final, slow breath, exhaled halfway, and found the natural respiratory pause. Her world compressed to a single, infinitely small point of focus. The crosshairs settled. She did not just fire one shot. Crack. The rifle recoiled, but she absorbed it perfectly, her body a part of the machine. Before the sound had even fully registered, she was working the bolt with fluid, practice speed. Crack. Another round sent, another bolt cycle, smooth as oiled glass. Crack, a third. Crack, a fourth. She was firing on the other targets, the ones Thorne had taken minutes to engage one by one. She was walking her way up the ladder from 1,500 yards to 1,800 to 2,000 to 2,200. She fired 4 shots in the time it took for the first bullet to complete its journey. Then came the sound. Not the puff of dust, but a sound that electrified the soul of every shooter on the line. A deep, resonant gong. A perfect hit on the 1,500-yard plate. Before they could process it, another sound echoed across the desert. Gong, the 1,800-yard target. Gong, 2,000 gong. 2,200. 4 shots fired, 4 perfect center mass hits, executed in less than 15 seconds. It was a display of riflecraft so far beyond the norm as to be almost unbelievable. Thorne's face had gone from smug to confused to utterly slack-jawed. The chorus was frozen, their minds struggling to catch up with what their eyes and ears were telling them. Petrova did not pause. Her focus remained absolute. She chambered her 5th and final round. Her gaze was fixed on the deceptor, the impossible shot. She settled the crosshairs back into that seemingly empty patch of air. The wind whispered its final secret to her. The mirage danced its hypnotic rhythm. For a heartbeat, the universe held its breath. Her fingers squeezed the trigger. The world broke. The 5th shot was gone. The silence that followed was different this time. It was heavier, freighted with the weight of 500 years of ballistic science and the focused intent of a true master. 4 seconds stretched into an eternity. The operators held their breath. Thorne was visibly trembling, though from rage or shock it was impossible to say. There was no puff of dust. Instead, a sharp metallic clang rocketed back across the immense distance, a sound as clear and final as a judgment bell. It was followed by a secondary, higher-pitched zing as something ricocheted off the steel. On the massive digital display board next to the command tent, which registered impacts on the reactive targets, a series of green lights had been flashing. Now, the final light, the one labeled Deceptor, blinked from red to a brilliant, undeniable green. A perfect dead-center hit. A collective gasp went through the chorus. They stared at the screen, then at the tiny figure on the firing mat, then back at the screen. It didn't compute. It was like watching a child lift a freight train. It violated the known laws of their universe. Chief Tanaka allowed himself a small, slow smile. He had not been wrong, but the display showed something else, something that made the impossible shot even more legendary. The central mass sensor on the Deceptor target was designed to register not just an impact, but the precise point of impact. Next to the green light, a small schematic of the target appeared. A single red dot glowed in the exact geometric center of the plate, and beside it, a damage report flashed in stark white letters. Structural integrity compromised, central bolt sheared. She hadn't just hit the impossible target, she had hit the half-inch hardened steel bolt that held the reactive plate to its mount, cleaving it perfectly in two. It was a shot so precise it bordered on the supernatural, a feat of marksmanship that would be dismissed as a wild exaggeration in a work of fiction. In the stunned, absolute silence that followed, Petrova calmly unchambered the spent casing, placing the warm brass shell neatly on the mat beside her. She pushed herself up with the same fluid grace she had lain down with. Her work was done. She turned and handed the Mark 22 back to Chief Tanaka, who took it with a look of profound, almost religious awe. She gave him a small, respectful nod. "It's a good rifle," she said, her voice still quiet, still uninflected. "Hold 0 well." The spell was broken by the crunch of boots on gravel. Colonel Vance stepped forward, his face unreadable but his eyes burning with an intense light. He walked directly onto the firing line, his gaze fixed on Petrova. He did not spare a single glance for the utterly broken form of Gunnery Sergeant Thorne, who stood as if turned to stone, his face the color of ash. The blood had drained from his face, leaving behind a mask of pure, unadulterated humiliation. His entire worldview, his carefully constructed persona of the ultimate authority, had been dismantled in under 30 seconds by a quiet woman he had dismissed as a librarian. Vance stopped directly in front of Petrova. The silence on the range was now absolute, a vacuum waiting to be filled. The operators of the chorus, the SEAL candidates, even Chief Tanaka, all stood motionless, witnesses to a moment that felt historic. "I haven't seen shooting like that since Kandahar 2012, Vance said, his voice a low, respectful murmur meant only for her. Then he raised his voice, addressing the entire dumbstruck assembly. "Gentlemen, you have just been given a lesson in humility, a lesson in the vast, humbling distance between competence and mastery." He turned his head slightly, his eyes finally falling on Thorne. "Gunner, you spoke of art versus science. You were wrong. True mastery is when the science is so deeply ingrained it becomes an art, when the data is no longer read from a screen, but felt in the bones." Vance turned his full attention back to Petrova. "Most of you know this woman as a range contractor. You know her as Anya. This is a failure of your observation skills, a failure I am here to correct." He let the words hang in the air, building the tension. "This is Master Sergeant Anya Petrova," he announced, his voice ringing with authority. "She is not a contractor. She is an active duty operator with a unit whose name you are not cleared to hear. She isn't here to maintain these targets. She's here because she designed them. She developed this entire training doctrine. The ballistic algorithms in your computers, she wrote the foundational code, the book on extreme long-range engagement you were all issued." He paused, letting the final devastating revelation land. She is the author. A wave of shock rippled through the crowd. Minds reeled, trying to reconcile the image of the quiet, unassuming target girl with the living legend Vance was describing. Thorne looked like he had been physically struck. The librarian, the woman he had publicly humiliated, was the architect of his entire profession. Vance wasn't finished. "In 2012, he continued, his voice dropping into a storyteller's cadence, a SEAL team was pinned down in a valley in Kandahar province. They were being engaged by a DSHK heavy machine gun nested in a cave mouth over 3,000 yards away. Air support was unavailable. They couldn't move. They were taking casualties. They were going to be overrun and wiped out. But they had a guardian angel they didn't even know was there." He pointed a single steady finger at Petrova. From a ridge over 2 miles away, through a gathering sandstorm, Master Sergeant Petrova, armed with a .408 Chaytak, calculated the impossible. She had one shot. She had to thread a bullet through a shifting wall of sand and into a cave, opening no bigger than a doorway. She fired. The flight time was nearly 7 seconds. The DSHK went silent. The gunner was neutralized. She saved all 12 members of that team. A shot that was never recorded, never decorated, because it officially never happened. He let the story settle, a tale of impossible heroism that dwarfed even the miracle they had just witnessed. The awe on the faces of the young operators was palpable. They were looking at her now, not as a woman, but as a mythical figure, a ghost of the battlefield made real. Now, Vance's gaze turned cold as it settled once more upon Gunnery Sergeant Thorne. The brief reverent warmth in his voice vanished, replaced by a chilling, razor-sharp precision. The air temperature seemed to drop by 20 degrees. "Gunnery Sergeant Thorne," he said, the words clipping out like shards of ice. "Your title is instructor. Your primary function is to impart knowledge, to cultivate skill, and to demonstrate the very ethos of the Marine Corps. Today, you have failed in every single one of those duties. You have displayed an arrogance that is toxic to the learning environment. You have prioritized your ego over verifiable fact. And you have shown profound disrespect, not to a subordinate, but to a master of your own craft." Thorne flinched as if he'd been slapped. He opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to offer an excuse, an apology, a desperate plea, but Vance cut him off with a sharp, slicing gesture of his hand. "Do not speak," the colonel commanded, his voice dropping to a near whisper that was somehow more menacing than any shout. "You are relieved of your duties as chief instructor for the advanced sniper course, effective immediately. Your command is being notified. You will report to the base weapon pool at 0600 tomorrow, where you will be assigned to inventory and maintenance duties. You will spend your days counting cleaning rods and inspecting firing pins, until a review board decides what to do with a gunner who has forgotten that the loudest voice on the range is rarely the most knowledgeable." The public humiliation was absolute, the punishment swift and devastatingly precise. Thorne was stripped of his authority, his prestige, his very identity, in front of the students who had idolized him moments before. He visibly deflated, the bonfire of his arrogance reduced to a pile of cold gray ash. He could only nod, his face a pale, sweating mask of ruin. His career was over. His legend, a lie, had been shattered by a truth he was too blind to see. Having passed judgment, Colonel Vance turned his back on the disgraced gunner, dismissing him from his reality. He faced Master Sergeant Petrova once more. The hardness in his expression melted away, replaced by a look of profound and sincere respect. He straightened his back, his posture becoming ramrod straight, a perfect picture of military bearing. Then, in the fading desert light, Colonel Marcus Vance, a decorated combat leader and a legend in his own right, brought his hand up in a slow, deliberate, and flawless salute. It was not the perfunctory gesture between ranks. It was a sign of deep personal veneration. It was a bow from one master to another, an acknowledgement that true authority is not granted by rank, but earned through an impossible standard of excellence. "Master Sergeant Petrova," he said, his voice filled with an unshakable sincerity, "it was an honor to see you work." For a moment, Petrova seemed taken aback, the only flicker of emotion she had shown all day. Then, she returned the gesture, her own salute just as crisp, just as perfect. The two stood there for a long moment, locked in a silent exchange of mutual respect that transcended rank, service, and gender. It was the institution itself, in the form of the colonel, bowing to the quiet competence it so desperately needed, but so often overlooked. Chief Tanaka, without hesitation, snapped to attention and rendered his own salute. One by one, like a wave spreading through the crowd, the young Marines and the SEAL candidates followed suit. The entire firing line stood at attention, saluting the unassuming woman they had mistaken for a mere technician. They were not saluting her rank, which they had only just learned. They were saluting the impossible thing they had just seen. They were saluting mastery. The legend of that day spread through the special operations community like a brush fire. It became known as the Master's Class on Range 4. The firing point where Petrova had taken her shots was officially designated Petrova's Perch, and a simple brass plaque was installed, inscribed with the date, the distance, and the 5 words Colonel Vance had spoken. "An honor to see you work." The bisected target bolt was recovered from the berm. It was mounted in a glass case in the main hall of the Marine Corps Scout Sniper School at Camp Pendleton, right next to the Medal of Honor citation of Carlos Hathcock. It served as a permanent physical reminder that the limits of possibility are often just the boundaries of one's own arrogance. The story became a mandatory case study at leadership academies across all branches, a parable about the critical difference between loud confidence and quiet competence. Months later, a very different Rex Thorne was seen sitting in the back of a basic marksmanship class. He was leaner, quieter, his eyes no longer blazing with self-importance, but holding a new, contemplative depth. He took meticulous notes. He listened more than he spoke. He spent his evenings not in the bar, boasting of his exploits, but in the library, poring over ballistics manuals, many of which he now knew had been written by the woman who had so thoroughly humbled him. He eventually earned his way back to being an instructor, but he was a changed man. He never raised his voice. His lessons were filled with warnings against ego and hubris, and he always began his first lecture to a new class by telling the story of the day a quiet librarian taught him what it truly meant to be a rifleman. He had become the primary teacher of the lesson he had learned so painfully, using his own spectacular failure as his most effective teaching tool. He had found redemption not in forgetting his humiliation, but in embracing it as the beginning of his true education. Anya Petrova was gone by sunrise the next morning. She had no interest in the legend she had created, the plaques, the stories, the awe in the eyes of the young operators. It meant nothing to her. Her work was not about recognition. It was about the silent, perfect execution of an impossible task. Her reward was not fame, but the quiet satisfaction of a problem solved, of an equation balanced. She returned to the shadows, to the classified world of whispered unit names and missions that officially never happened. Her legacy was not the single incredible event on a dusty range in Yuma. It was in the subtle, positive cultural shift she had unknowingly initiated. It was in the new generation of operators who now understood that true strength was not measured by the volume of a voice or the rank on a collar, but by the quiet, undeniable evidence of mastery. It was in the way a SEAL chief now taught his students to listen to the wind, and in the way a humbled Marine gunner now taught his to listen, above all, to the quiet professionals who walk among them, disguised as librarians and target girls, waiting for the moment when their art is required.